Thanks very much for having me here today. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about babies in buildings. I run the Sussex Baby Lab. So we're a research group at the University of Sussex, and we do research into how babies see, think, and learn. We use a range of techniques. So we show babies pairs of stimuli, such as colours, and we look at their looking preferences. We also record their eye movements using eye trackers. We measure their brain activity, and recently we've also done a study where we put little cameras on babies' heads and set them off into the world and record their visual perspective. All of this results in scientific publications in a range of scientific journals, and we also work with designers to apply our findings to the design of various things, ranging from baby books to baby drama, baby products, and educational materials. We became interested in babies and buildings first when we ran this baby art gallery. So we curated a baby art gallery for the British Science Festival, where we gave professional artists a brief of how infants see, and we asked them to submit art that was optimized for babies that would maximally engage them. We then eye-tracked babies looking at the art, and we showed the eye-tracking heat maps next to the art in the gallery, so the caregivers could learn about infant vision and the babies could enjoy the art. To our surprise, the art which babies looked at the longest wasn't the faces or the fluffy, cute animals. It was this picture of buildings by Ruth Parkinson. And this really sparked our interest into how babies respond to aesthetic stimuli, such as art, but also how they respond to their built environment. So following up on this question about infants and aesthetics, our next study paired 40 Van Gogh landscapes against each other, and we showed these as pairs to babies and just simply recorded their looking time. What we found was that babies will look longer at the landscapes the more pleasant adults find them. So we find this small but significant relationship, and you can see this in this figure here. So the landscapes which adults generally find as pleasant are generally the ones that infants look longest at. And we developed a model which can predict how long infants look based on various visual features of the art, such as various colours or spatial features. So the idea here is that we can trace back our aesthetic judgments to the very early sensory biases of our visual system. And this was covered in various media outlets. So in The Observer, it was argued that art is a natural impulse. So some aspect of our aesthetic judgment is due to these natural sensory biases, and babies are a barometer for revealing this sensory bias. So we then thought, well, what about babies' fascination with buildings? And so in this study, we showed babies various natural scenes, some of them which were of nature and some of them which included urban environments. This study was done during the pandemic, so we had to close the baby lab for a couple of years, but instead we thought we'd do it on iPads. So we had parents in their homes show pairs of these scenes to babies on an iPad, and then we recorded their looking times over Zoom, so our baby Zoom method. And you can see this video here of the baby, and what you'll see is just them looking between left and right, and occasionally they'll see something which really engages them, and you can kind of see their little eyes pop out a bit. So what we found was that the scenes which babies looked at the longest weren't the natural scenes, which was what we were actually expecting, but these scenes which included the architecture that actually adults rated as most aesthetically pleasing. And again, we developed a model which would predict how long babies look at these scenes, and it was the edge density and the symmetry and the contours of these beautiful buildings, or these aesthetically pleasing buildings, which were engaging infants to look. So you can see there how the babies are just kind of really looking at the scenes. So we then zoomed in on this in the next study by showing these photographs taken by Christoph Redis. He's a vision scientist. And there are two buildings of, two stories of buildings, mostly in Vienna and Berlin. So you can just see the facades of the buildings in black and white. You can see that they range in visual complexity from really basic to more complex architecture. And again, we just paired these buildings against each other, but this time we're back in the lab, so we recorded eye movements with an eye tracker. So I should say that all of these studies with infants all start from the age of 4 months and up, so they're really little babies. What we found was, again, this relationship between infant looking and adult aesthetic judgment. So you can see that in this figure here. So if you look in the top corner over there, then those buildings, the more complex facades, infants are looking for the longest amount of time, and adults are rating those as most pleasant. Whereas at the bottom, these blocky, simple facades are the ones which infants are looking at the least and adults are rating as the least pleasant. So a really strong relationship between infant looking and adult aesthetic judgment. I've got some clips to show you this in action. So what you're going to see here are 2 images. So this is what the baby was shown. And superimposed, you're going to see a red blob. So the babies didn't see this red blob. This is the output of the eye tracker. And it's showing you where they're looking when they look at these 2 pairs of buildings. So here you can see when these 2 buildings are paired, they go straight for the more ornate building facade, and they go for the curved arches of that building facade as well. So these are just 4 months old infants. If we look at another one, so again, they're choosing the more ornate building facade, and the embellishments on that building facade is specifically what's capturing their attention. And here we're pairing 2 ornate buildings, and you can see how they're dividing their time equally, flicking backwards and forwards, and again, focusing on the ornate parts of the building. So here are the static heat maps. So you can see various pairs of buildings, and it just shows you that infants are really spending very little time looking at these boring buildings with the blocky architecture, and they're going for the more complex, ornate architecture and those embellished areas of them. Ooh. Hang on. We've stopped. Someone up. Oh, yeah, okay. So all of this work with infants really resonates with this quote from Thomas Heatherwick's Humanized book. So Thomas says, "We naturally appreciate order, symmetry, and patterns in artworks and objects. Humans also like complexity. We gravitate towards interesting things that invite us to look more, to understand them. And this is surely related to our evolution in natural environments." So this really resonates with what we find with our very young infants. So complexity, order, symmetry, natural patterns, is what actually is engaging the infants. I think we might have skipped a few slides, actually. Yeah, okay, so here we go. Going back. So our building study, we then analysed what it was that was actually engaging infants. Back one more slide, sorry. Yeah, okay. I should say that this finding of babies in building facades was covered by the Times, and they argued that babies like buildings with bells and whistles. So what are the bells and whistles? Well, we've done this image analysis. So we analysed the building facades to look at their natural scene statistics. So a natural scene statistic is a statistical regularity in a scene that is characteristic of natural scenes, so nature. The one that we found that related most strongly to infant looking was edge orientation entropy. So in a nutshell, it's the amount of randomness or variability in the orientation of edges in an image. So a building that's dominated by just a couple of orientations has got low edge orientation entropy. So it's just got a couple of orientations, whereas one with high edge orientation entropy, all of the orientations of those edges are more or equally represented. So there's more variability in the orientation. And we find that edge orientation entropy is the best predictor of infant looking, so it really strongly relates. So the more edge orientations, the longer infants look. Another natural scene statistic is fractal dimension. So fractals are where you have patterns that repeat on multiple spatial scales. And people have argued that fractals are the nature of language. So they're really common in lightning, in coastlines, snowflakes, plant patterns. And of course, they're also highly present in some types of architecture. And so we've also done a study where we showed infants these statistical fractals. So they're just black and white patterns, but they vary in the amount of fractal complexity. And we found that both infants and adults look longer at these very basic stimuli, the greater the fractal complexity. It's something that our visual system is oriented towards. So as I've said, this all resonates with Thomas's quote. So infants, even when they're 4 months old, are seeking out, their visual systems are seeking out these elements of sensory stimulation. So we've applied these findings to various contexts. So we've worked with the educational publisher. Anyone who's a parent during lockdown might be familiar with Twinkle. So we've developed these sensory cards for babies that incorporate complex buildings such as the pavilion. And we've also incorporated buildings into the design of some baby books, which I've authored. So here you can see infants looking, being really engaged with this image of St. Paul's Cathedral. We've also worked with the designer Camille Walala. So she's incorporated some of the learnings from infant sensory biases to design this pattern, which was intended to be maximally engaging for infants. And that's part of a collaboration with Etta Love, so it's built into their baby products. But what does this mean for buildings? What does this mean for the design of buildings? You might ask, do babies even see buildings? Is this even part of their experience? Well, when we've done this baby headcam study where babies are set off around their daily life with little cameras on their heads, it turns out that buildings are part of their visual diet. So they do see buildings in their daily life, albeit from a strange angle, from slightly lower to the ground and slightly jaunty angle. But buildings is part of what they see. And as babies grow, as they become more mobile and get more out into the outside world, then the influence of the built environment on their visual diet will become even stronger. So I propose that we need to factor development into this emerging field of neurodesign and neuroaesthetics, neuroarchitecture. We need to also think about development. So I've shown in today's talk how we can study infants to identify our early sensory biases. So when our visual systems are in their purest form, before we've developed culture and experience and we've formed aesthetic opinions, what is it that our visual systems actually are drawn to? What is it that they want? There's also lots of other open questions. So for example, what's the impact of the built environment on the brain and behavior and the health and well-being of infants and early years children? I argue that it might be that you get an even stronger effect of the built environment during development in children. So anyone who's a caregiver will know that when you put your child in an aversive space, then you generally tend to get behavioral meltdowns. So I call it the Tesco tantrum effect in my family. So, you know, where there's aversive light or monotonous visual stimulation, then children find it really hard to self-regulate in those environments. So this question is open. You know, how does this affect our brain and behavior in infancy and childhood? And then another question is, well, what's the influence of early experience on later life? So there's lots of ample evidence that our experience as infants and children shapes us. It shapes who we become. So at the level of the language that we hear, the faces that we hear, the music that we hear. And I think it's really important to look at how the built environment might shape how we develop and how those aesthetic judgments might form later in life as well. So finally, just to acknowledge the team. So here's the Sussex Colour Group and the Sussex Baby Lab, which I lead outside our most Favourite joyful local building, the Town Art Gallery. A lot of the experiments that I've presented today are done by Philip McAdams as part of his PhD, and also in collaboration with Alice Skelton, who's also at Sussex. And our research has been funded by the European Research Council for the last 12 years, and also the Economic and Social Research Council. And then finally, my details are there. If anyone's interested in joining in this endeavour in factoring development into the field of neurodesign, then please do get in touch. We're always looking for industrial partners and collaborators. Thanks very much.